My golden child sister used my wedding to propose to her boyfriend, completely ruining my day. So I made sure she'd never get to walk down the aisle. Hi, I'm Chloe, 33. I've always been the second choice, the afterthought. My sister, Emma, 31F, is the one with the sparkling eyes, the perfect GPA, the effortless charm. She's the kind of person who could trip over a sidewalk crack and somehow make it look like a dance. I, on the other hand, was the responsible one, the reliable one. You know, the one who never made waves, who always picked up the pieces, who swallowed her feelings for the sake of family peace. So when I got engaged to Mark, the love of my life, I naively hoped my wedding would be the one day where I got to shine, where the spotlight would, for once, be mine. I should have known better. It started with small, annoying comments. My dress choice was a bit simple. My venue could use a bit more color. My guest list was kind of small, don't you think? Classic Emma. But I let it slide. I was too happy to let her passive-aggressive barbs ruin my mood. After all, Mark and I had worked hard to save for this day, planning every detail ourselves down to the last rose petal on the aisle. The day of the wedding, I woke up feeling like I was floating. The morning air was crisp, the sun warm but not too harsh, the kind of weather you dream of for an outdoor ceremony. My bridesmaids buzzed around me like cheerful bees, adjusting my veil, helping me with my makeup, telling me how stunning I looked. For once I believed them. Then Emma arrived. She swept into the bridal suite like a tornado in designer heels, all high energy and louder than necessary greetings. She looked flawless, of course, in her deep red dress, the one I specifically asked her not to wear because it clashed with the pastel tones of my wedding theme. But that was Emma. Rules were merely suggestions, and other people's wishes were just speed bumps on the road to her own happiness. She wrapped me in a tight hug, her expensive perfume filling my nose, and whispered, "You look beautiful, sis." I smiled, genuinely touched, until she added, "Even if the dress is a bit safe." She stepped back, giving me a once-over with those sharp, assessing eyes, then turned her attention to my maid of honor. I brushed it off, took a deep breath, and forced myself to focus on the day ahead. The ceremony went perfectly. Mark's vows had me choking back tears, and when we kissed to seal our promises, I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. As we walked back down the aisle to the sound of clapping and cheers, I thought, just for a second, that maybe, just maybe, I'd get my fairy tale day. Then came the reception. The tent was strung with twinkling lights, the tables set with fresh peonies and flickering candles, the band already warming up. I was chatting with my childhood best friend, a glass of champagne in hand, when the murmur started. A few gasps, the clink of dropped cutlery, and then the unmistakable sound of applause. I turned confused, my veil catching slightly on a chair as I twisted around. There in the middle of my perfectly curated dance floor was Emma on one knee, holding up a small velvet box. Her boyfriend, Jake, stood over her, hand to his mouth, eyes wide. Around them, our guests had formed a loose circle, phones already out, capturing the moment. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Oh my God," whispered my maid of honor, her hand flying to her mouth. Is she really?" Emma beamed up at Jake, her voice echoing through the tent as she said, "Jake, my love, will you marry me?" He blinked, clearly stunned, before breaking into a grin and pulling her up into a tight embrace. The tent erupted into cheers and applause, guests whistling and clapping, a few even wiping away tears. And there I stood, frozen in my white lace, my new husband's arm slowly slipping from my waist as the weight of what had just happened hit me. Emma had hijacked my wedding. As Jake twirled her around, the band, clearly as caught off guard as I was, fumbled into an impromptu cover of "Marry You" by Bruno Mars. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the music, the cheers, the clinking of champagne glasses. I felt my new husband's hand tighten on my arm, his jaw clenched. I locked eyes with Emma as she spun past me, her eyes glittering with the thrill of her grand gesture. She had the audacity to wink at me. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I would not let this slide. If she wanted to steal my moment, my one perfect day, then I would make damn sure she never got hers. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I plastered on a smile for the first dance, clenched my jaw through the speeches, and forced myself to laugh at the best man's cringy, overly rehearsed toast. Every time I glanced at Emma, she was wrapped around Jake, her face alight with a self-satisfied glow that only deepened when she caught my eye. I spent the whole night like that, smiling for photos, posing with relatives, accepting congratulations from well-meaning but oblivious guests. It was torture. Mark could tell. He kept whispering, "We can slip out early, you know. Just say the word." But I shook my head each time. I refused to let her drive me away from my own wedding. But the real gut punch came later. It was during the bouquet toss, that silly, tradition-bound moment I hadn't even wanted but was talked into by my mother and aunts. The photographer had everyone lined up, single women crowding behind me, Emma front and center, her perfectly curled hair bouncing as she whispered something to Jake. I turned my back, clutched my bouquet, and tossed it over my shoulder. The whoop of victory that followed was piercing, like a knife to the chest. I whipped around to see Emma clutching my bouquet, bouncing on her toes, Jake sweeping her into a dramatic dip as their friends cheered. I felt my smile crack, my carefully controlled mask slipping for the first time that night. Emma met my eyes, her smile sharp and victorious, a queen with her hard-won crown. Mark's hand found mine, his fingers squeezing tight. I could feel the tension in his grip, the silent plea for me not to cause a scene. I took a deep breath, forced the bile back down my throat, and managed a thin, tight-lipped smile. But inside, I was already plotting. The next morning, as Mark and I packed for our honeymoon, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Emma. OMG, thank you so much for letting me share your special day. It just felt right, you know? I hope you're not mad. We're sisters, after all. Love you. I stared at the screen, my hand shaking. Mark leaned over my shoulder, read the message, and let out a low, bitter laugh. She's unbelievable, he muttered, shoving another pair of shorts into his duffel. She's a narcissist, I corrected, my voice cold. I set my phone down and took a slow, deliberate breath. I wasn't just angry. I was seething, my thoughts sharp and cutting, like shards of glass grinding together. But anger, I reminded myself, wasn't enough. Not for this. I needed a plan. I spent the first few days of our honeymoon alternating between blissful, sun-drenched beach moments with Mark and stolen minutes on my laptop researching. I dug through old emails, Facebook posts, Instagram stories, anything that might be useful. I unearthed every petty slight, every thoughtless comment, every instance where Emma had trampled over someone else's happiness for her own benefit. I compiled it all into a neat little digital folder, like a lawyer preparing for trial. Mark caught me one night, my screen casting a harsh blue glow across our hotel room as he stepped out of the shower. He raised an eyebrow, his towel slung low on his hips. Babe, what are you doing? Just making sure my sister gets what she deserves, I said, my voice too calm, too measured. He studied me for a long moment, then sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Just promise me you won't let this ruin what we have. She's not worth it. I forced a smile, closed my laptop, and crossed the room to wrap my arms around him. But even as he held me, the ocean breeze drifting in through the balcony doors, my mind was elsewhere. Because here's the thing, I had realized something during those long, angry nights. Emma's need to be the center of attention, her desperate, clawing hunger for validation, was her greatest weakness. And I was going to exploit it. I was going to make her regret ever stepping foot onto my dance floor. And by the time I was done, she would never ever walk down one of her own. When we got back from our honeymoon, Emma was already in full bride mode. She called me the night we landed, her voice bright and chirpy, talking a mile a minute about venues, flowers, color schemes, and seating charts. I barely had time to drop my suitcase before she launched into a detailed breakdown of her dream wedding, a lavish, over-the-top affair, the kind you see in glossy magazines and reality TV shows. And of course, my parents had promised to help foot the bill. I shouldn't have been surprised. They'd always treated Emma like a precious, fragile jewel, the golden child who could do no wrong. They'd covered her college tuition, bought her first car, even helped her with a down payment on a condo when she got her first real job. Meanwhile, I had worked my way through college on scholarships and part-time jobs, scraped together a down payment on my first apartment, and planned my entire wedding without a dime of family support. But I didn't let it bother me, not this time. Because I had a plan. Emma wanted her wedding to be the event of the decade, and she was determined to outshine everyone, including me. She even joked about it one night over wine, her eyes sparkling as she described the crystal chandeliers, the 5-course meal, the designer dress she had her eye on. Sorry sis, she teased, clinking her glass against mine. But I have to one-up you. It's just how it is. I forced a laugh, pretending to brush it off, but inside I felt that cold, sharp anger twist tighter around my heart. Over the next few months, I watched as Emma flitted from one boutique to another, dragging me along for dress fittings, cake tastings, and floral arrangements. She even dragged me to her venue, a sprawling estate just outside the city, with manicured gardens, marble fountains, and a ballroom straight out of a fairy tale. It was breathtaking, I'll admit. Can you just imagine it? She said, spinning in a slow circle on the sunlit lawn, her designer dress rustling like autumn leaves. Me walking down the aisle, everyone watching, the perfect day. I bit my tongue, forcing a smile. Oh, I could imagine it. I could imagine it perfectly. But I kept my mouth shut, playing the supportive sister, letting her bask in her spotlight. Because I knew the more perfect she tried to make her day, the more devastating my little surprise would be. Then, one afternoon, I stumbled across a critical piece of information. Something that changed the entire game. I had been casually scrolling through my messages when I noticed a new email from one of Emma's old college roommates. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but she had sent me a link to a wedding blog saying, "Thought you'd find this interesting." Curious, I clicked it. And there, halfway down the page, was a post titled, 10 Bridesmaids Horror Stories That Will Make You Rethink Your Wedding Party. I skimmed the list, chuckling at the stories of bridezillas and wardrobe malfunctions, until I hit number 7. It was about Emma. I read it once, twice, my pulse pounding in my ears as the words sank in. It described in painful detail how Emma had humiliated her former best friend during her own wedding, stealing the spotlight with a drunken, attention-seeking toast that left the bride in tears. I vaguely remembered hearing about the incident back then, but Emma had brushed it off as a misunderstanding and swore the other girl was just being overly sensitive. But this blog post painted a different picture. One of a manipulative, attention-hungry woman who couldn't stand not being the center of the universe, even for one night. I felt a slow, wicked smile spread across my face. This was exactly the kind of dirt I needed. The kind that would hit Emma where it hurt the most, her image. I copied the link, filed it away in my ever-growing folder of blackmail, and closed my laptop with a satisfying snap. Part 1. The Ghosts of Friendships Past. The weeks leading up to Emma's wedding felt like the calm before a storm. I played my part perfectly, the supportive sister, the one who bit her tongue through every condescending comment and snide remark. But behind that polite smile I was weaving my trap. First I made a few quiet calls. Emma might have been the queen of her social circle, but she had left a trail of burned bridges and broken friendships in her wake. I reached out to some of her old college friends, the ones she had ghosted when they were no longer useful or fun enough for her. I even managed to track down a few former bridesmaids she had unceremoniously dumped from her original bridal party for being too basic or not Instagram ready. Their responses were enthusiastic. It seemed that a lot of people had been waiting for a chance to settle the score with Emma. I made sure these forgotten friends and discarded allies were seated right up front, close enough to the altar that Emma would see every shocked, judging face as she walked down the aisle. I even slipped a few extra tickets to Jake's cousins, the ones Emma once called too tacky to include in her engagement party guest list, just for good measure. Part 2. The Budget Cut Sabotage. Next, I had a subtle chat with my parents. I casually mentioned that the floral arrangements Emma had chosen were a bit too extravagant, maybe a little overwhelming for a wedding budget. I suggested a more timeless, elegant look, which conveniently happened to be significantly cheaper. They took my advice, and the sprawling, elaborate rose displays Emma had been dreaming of were swapped for more modest, locally sourced arrangements. I also hinted that a full open bar was an unnecessary expense, especially with so many lightweight drinkers on the guest list. My parents, always practical when it came to saving a few bucks, agreed, cutting the open bar to just the first hour of the reception. I could already imagine the moment Emma would realize that her dream of a champagne-soaked celebration had been quietly gutted. Part 3. The Digital Dagger. On the morning of the wedding, I woke up with a sense of calm determination. I sipped my coffee slowly, watching the early sunlight creep across my kitchen floor, and hit send on my carefully crafted email. I had included a link to that infamous blog post, along with a few handpicked screenshots of Emma's most self-centered texts and tone-deaf social media posts. Just enough to plant the seeds of doubt, to remind her guests that the perfect bride they were celebrating was anything but. I arrived at the venue early, dressed in a deep green gown that brought out the fire in my eyes, and took my seat in the second row, where I could observe every flicker of Emma's carefully controlled expression. I watched as the guests began checking their phones, puzzled frowns spreading like a slow wave through the crowd. One older aunt leaned over to her husband, her eyes narrowing as she whispered behind a manicured hand. A few people even pulled their heads together in small, conspiratorial groups, their eyes darting from their screens to the flower-covered arch where Emma would soon appear. I spotted one of Emma's former roommates from college, the one she cut off after a petty argument over a bachelorette party, sitting near the aisle. She glanced at her phone, her perfectly lined eyes widening before a slow, wicked grin spread across her lips. She leaned over to her husband, showing him the screen, and they both burst into quiet, disbelieving laughter, quickly stifled by a stern look from one of Emma's aunts. Part 4. The Walk of Doubt. Then the music swelled. The guests rose to their feet, their polite applause tinged with attention that Emma, in her bridal bliss, seemed oblivious to. I watched her step onto the aisle, her father at her side, her smile as blinding as the crystals on her veil. But as she walked closer, her eyes began to flicker with confusion. She was close enough now to see the tight, uncomfortable smiles, the averted gazes, the awkward shuffling of feet. I caught the eye of one of Jake's groomsmen, a tall, broad-shouldered guy with a military haircut, who had his jaw clenched so tightly his neck veins were visible. He glanced at Emma, then at Jake, his expression shifting from concern to quiet anger as he slid his phone back into his pocket. When Emma reached the altar, her smile had tightened into a strained grimace, her knuckles white around her bouquet. Jake, her groom, shifted uncomfortably beside her, clearly picking up on the strange, tense energy but unsure what had caused it. I leaned back in my seat, a small, satisfied smile playing at my lips. Part 5, The Speech That Cuts Deep. The ceremony passed in a blur, Emma's voice slightly shaky as she repeated her vows, Jake glancing nervously at the guests as if sensing the undercurrent of gossip and judgment. Then came the reception. I had waited for this moment. When it was my turn to give a toast, I stood slowly, my glass raised high, and took a deep breath, letting the room fall silent around me. To Emma and Jake, I began, my voice steady and clear. Today we celebrate not just their love but the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect, the foundations of a lasting marriage. I let my words hang for a moment, my eyes never leaving Emma's. Emma, you've always been the star. You shine so brightly that sometimes those around you fade into the shadows. But in a marriage, it's not just about one person's spotlight. It's about sharing that light, letting your partner be seen, be valued. I truly hope you remember that. I paused, watching her smile falter, her jaw tightening as my words began to cut deeper. Because a marriage is only as strong as the trust it's built on. And if that trust is broken, if that spotlight starts to feel more like a harsh, exposing glare, well, I hope you're ready for that too. I took a slow sip of my champagne, never breaking eye contact. To Emma and Jake, may your love be as pure as the image you project. I set my glass down and took my seat, the room still ringing with the sharp edges of my words. Emma's cheeks flushed a furious red, her fingers trembling around the stem of her wine glass. Jake glanced at her, his brow furrowed, his eyes searching hers for some silent reassurance. But Emma just sat there frozen, her mask slipping for the first time that day. I set down my glass and sat down, the room still echoing with the harsh words. Emma's cheeks were flushed with a fierce blush, her fingers trembling around the stem of her glass. Jake stared at her, frowning, searching her eyes for silent reassurance. But Emma just sat there frozen, her mask slipping for the first time all day. I watched as one of Emma's old college friends, a petite blonde named Sarah, slowly set down her glass, her lips stretching in a small, sly smile. She leaned toward the woman next to her, a former bridesmaid whom Emma had dumped without explanation, and whispered something that made them both snort softly into their champagne. Then, as if some unspoken signal had passed through the room, more whisperings. The guests exchanged sharp remarks, their heads cocked toward each other, their eyes darting to Emma like a predator stalking its prey. I caught snippets of their hushed conversation, words like two-faced and attention-grabbing frog, cutting through the thick, uncomfortable silence. And then it happened. One of the guests, a tall red-haired woman in an elegant black dress whom I vaguely recognized as one of Emma's former roommates, stood up, her chair scraping loudly on the polished floor. She cleared her throat, and all the heads turned, and the room fell into a stunned, expectant silence. I just have to say something, she began, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the silence like a blade. I didn't mean to, but after that wonderful speech, I feel like honesty really should be the theme of the evening. Emma's head snapped around, her eyes widening, the blood draining from her face as the woman continued. Emma, the woman said with a cold, mocking smile, remember the summer after junior year? When you borrowed my car for a weekend getaway and then conveniently forgot to mention the accident you got into? Or how you kicked me out after I asked you to help cover the cost of the repairs? A wave of shocked whispers spread through the room. Emma opened her mouth, then closed it, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an ally. But there was none. Oh, and let's not forget your 25th anniversary. Another voice interrupted her, a tall, elegant woman with dark curls, her tone laced with sarcasm. When you accidentally scheduled your party for the same night as my engagement dinner, and then had the audacity to feign surprise when half my guest list didn't show because you guilt-tripped them into choosing you. Emma's jaw dropped, her eyes wild with fear and disbelief. Jake turned to look at her, his face pale, his brows furrowed in silent embarrassment. And then, like a dam breaking, the flood began. One by one, people in the room stood up, each adding their own story to Emma's growing pile of betrayals and manipulations. The former colleague she'd stabbed in the back to get a promotion. The sister of an ex-boyfriend she had humiliated at a family barbecue. Even one of Jake's cousins who had told her how Emma had once tried to flirt with him at a Christmas party, dismissing it as a joke when he had spoken to her. I watched, my heart pounding with a twisted pleasure as Emma's world crumbled around her. She sat there, frozen in her designer dress, her carefully curated image shattering into pieces, each bitter confession another hammer blow on the fragile glass castle she had built around herself. Finally, when the room was quiet again, I took a slow sip of champagne, letting the bubbles burst sharply against my tongue, and set my glass down with a soft, deliberate clink. Emma's wide, tearful eyes met mine across the room, her chest heaving, her sigh short, panicked. I stared at her for a long, cold moment, then nodded, barely perceptible content. Without another word, I stood up, picked up my bag, and walked slowly toward the exit, my heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. I felt dozens of eyes following me, the whispers behind me again, but I didn't look back. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, the muted chaos of a ruined wedding behind me, I felt a deep, cleansing sense of freedom wash over me. I cut off all contact with Emma from that night onward. My parents tried to make me forgive her, but I calmly reminded them that family is supposed to protect you, not sabotage you at every turn. I moved with Mark to a new city, started a new job, and finally found the quiet, carefree happiness I had lived with for so many years.